Welcome to Crushgasm, the podcast that's been dedicated to bringing you the highs and lows of crushes for almost 2 years now, but we're shaking things up for the next couple of months to crush on a whole decade. Yep, we're talking all things 90s with some familiar faces, well, voices, like today's guest, Jamie Dyer. He's the host of 90s and Noughties, a podcast tailor-made to go over a year like 1991, and I'm excited that he'll give us a pop culture perspective from across the pond. We originally met Jamie when he came through to talk about his childhood crush and icon of the 90s, Melissa Joan Hart, which we'll get to later. But first, Jamie, how have you been?
I've been very well, taken somewhat of a break from 90s and Noughties UK, but trying to come back, and this seems like a very good warm-up exercise, so thank you for inviting me on.
Of course, I wanted to bring back some of my favorite people I got to meet through the first 100 episodes. This is an exciting way to do so. And who doesn't love the 90s?
Exactly.
So before we start, I know you said you took a little break, but where can we find 90s and Noughties online?
So you can find 90s and Noughties UK by just checking out your favorite podcast provider. So that's, Apple, the Spotify is quite good. The Spotify, with the added the. Basically, anywhere you get your podcasts, you can find it. We'll be trying to record episodes very soon.
All right, and let's kick this off just with a simple, what were you doing in 1991?
I was probably laying on the floor in 1991 because I was born in 1989, so I was about 2 years old, less than 2, and so that's about it. A lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about, obviously, I'll be thinking of from a much more modern perspective than at the time. But part of my reason, because you asked what year I wanted to do, part of my reason for choosing 1991 is because whenever I've just fished something out and thought, I'll give that a go, I've ended up liking it. And 9 times out of 10, it comes from 1991. So it just seemed right. But none of it is first-hand experience.
Yeah, I was turning 4, so not a lot I quite remember at the time, but definitely looking at what came out and everything I did watch and take it in later. So we're going to start off a little serious because the show Dairy Girls, it's set in Ireland, and that's not it's not about watching it, but when I was watching it, they talk about a lot of things, real world things that went down in the 90s and Ireland at the time, and it was really serious. There was wars going on, and they did touch on some pop culture aspects like The Usual Suspects and Spice Girls, but when we look back at the 90s, because we were kids, we have all these great memories. I don't think we have all the bad news stories kind of things. Do you think that's because as kids we do wear these rose-colored glasses?
I think possibly, unless you do live in a place where those things have occurred, and of course you can't escape it. But yeah, I do think we do tend to wear rose-colored glasses when it comes to things like that. And maybe actually later on you check some of these things out and you think, well, why did I like that?
Oh, for sure. You go back to what was there? But do you think kids today have that same privilege? Because in the 90s, we didn't have the internet unless you were super fancy or something like that, especially in 1991 was David around? I don't think so. But today kids have social media and they see all the bad things. So I don't know if they can wear the rose-colored glasses,
I don't think so. I think certainly with the last couple of years with COVID, that's probably going to affect the next generation quite a lot, I would think. And so there might be rose-colored glasses about what might seemingly be odd stuff. So when people were in lockdown and things like that, even now we think, oh, how interesting that was to be there and what we did. And, so it's very easy to do. But I do agree with you that I think that these days it's less likely with the next generation.
Yeah, and so I like that we're gonna start off a little serious, but we're gonna lighten things up because we're gonna talk about your favorite pop culture moment. Well, one of them from 1991, and that is Marky Mark's "Good Vibrations." Again, you were only like a toddler, probably potty training at the time, but what like now makes that a song like it for you for that year?
It was so difficult when you said, "Oh, do your pop culture kind of moment from that year." It was so difficult. Even before I came on here, I was looking up the tracks from '91, and to be honest, any of them could have been my pop culture pick. But I first discovered this particular track when I bought a compilation of 1991 songs on a vinyl album, and I put it on, and it's the first track. And you know when a track kind of epitomizes what you're about to hear, everything kind of fits together, and you think that is the perfect track to start with it. Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch, "Good Vibrations," is one of those tracks. And to me, pop music at that point, certainly pop music in the UK, tended to go something like this. Maybe a sample here and there, very upbeat, and then a random rap stuck in the middle of it. That seemed to be the thing that was going on at the time. So to me, Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch just epitomizes that completely.
And I think when in the grand scheme of what I think 90s and 90s music is, it's kind of like not groundbreaking in any way. I don't think it's just like maybe for some things like grunge and everything, but like the pop music mainstream, it was just so like a wild, wild west of sounds. We had like the electronic kind of what I call spin class music, which is what I think Good Vibrations is to like pop. And that's what I love about 90s and like the charts back then. It was just like, I would say like a potpourri of just all these sounds, and just Marky Mark I think is so 90s. Like there's some bands you hear like Tears for Fears and you're like, that's so 80s.
Yeah.
It's a signature. So I thought Marky Mark was such a good choice.
Oh, thank you, because I was very nervous. And to be honest, I was looking up beforehand and I was like, wait a minute, 1991 is the year that Tammy Wynette duetted with an English dance act called KLF, which is very odd. You know, this country superstar doing a dance record about ice cream vans with a British band, which I thought, oh, you wouldn't know that in America. It might be one of those things that just hit here. No, it was like a top 20 hit in the States. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There's such a mixture of things. I mean, one of the number one records here in 91 was a British comedian doing a cover version with sort of an indie rock band of a 1960s tune, and that hit the top of the charts here. And he was sort of an alternative comic type comedian. So yeah, every year I think has these little fads and these little things that go on, but 1991 in particular seems to be incredibly eclectic, save for a certain Robin Hood track.
Yeah, we'll get to Robin Hood, but we're going to go over something that we've been doing here on the show. It's going to be the running segment. We're going to talk about people's sexiest man alive and the most beautiful person. So People magazine, they started most beautiful in 1990. So this would be the second person. Do you have any guess of who People chose as the sexiest man in 91?
Would it be somebody like Brad Pitt?
It would be somebody like that, but it is not Brad Pitt.
Oh, okay. I'm stumped.
It is Patrick Swayze. He had the number one movie the year prior with Ghost, and I think people were really digging Point Break, so he was there. And could you guess the most beautiful person, which I will give you a hint, is female?
Would it be somebody like, I might be slightly out, maybe Pamela Anderson?
America's Sweetheart, Julia Roberts. She just had Pretty Woman, and then people are like into loving that Sleeping with the Enemy and Hook, which we're going to talk about Hook in a little bit, but I want to start with TV first. In 90s TV for kids, 1991, we got Nickelodeon. We got our first Nicktoons with Doug, Rugrats, and Ren and Stimpy. And I know you're an advocate for getting streamers to give you the goods overseas, but were you able to watch those back in the day?
I was, yeah. I was lucky enough in the late 90s to have access to Sky Television, which carried Nickelodeon. And so I saw all of the things that you mentioned. And to me, Rugrats is like the ultimate one. I love it, and yet I hate it in simple measure, because it's like there's better Nicktoons out there, but Rugrats just had everything. And now, as the father of a 2-year-old who absolutely loves Rugrats, it's like a whole different generation that gets to discover this. Not so keen on the remake, but the original, yeah.
I tried. I didn't get far into it. It was really scary. I was gonna say, but I did an episode of Writer's Bagel Basket where we talked about the Snick lineup, and one of the shows was Rugrats. He was like, choose your favorite, and I chose the one Susie first appeared on because I love Susie Carmichael. And it was like, I was watching it as an adult, and I'm like, this is a really creative show. Like, how they got the perspective of what a 1 to 3-year-old would be like and act like in the day. And I think it's so creative. I think that's probably why it stands out as one of the best Nicktoons.
It still works now, and even the perspective, from a parent's perspective, they had that nailed down. There are some things that the parents do. I mean, you got to realize the parents in Rugrats are seemingly terrible parents, because the kids just run wild, and like they'll put a gate up and ask several times, how did they get out of the gate? Which is kind of random. And I think the most relatable thing, there's an episode where Angelica is ill, or pretending to be ill, and she orders Stu to make chocolate pudding at like 2 a.m. and Dee Dee comes in and says, why are you making chocolate pudding at 2 a.m? And he's like, I've lost control of my life. And it's exactly. And like I say, even now watching it, they nailed down the perspective from the kids, because you're like, that's exactly how kids think. They hear something, it's literal, but the parents, as you watch as an adult, again, nailed down. Wonderful.
And I think another reason that Rugrats stands out is the voice actors. You have like from Cree Summers that you do daily. Do you think, like, as far as Nicktoons, Rugrats is maybe top notch for the, like, who was voicing? Because they have so many great, memorable voices on Nickelodeon.
I think so. I think when it comes to voice talents, the talent on Rugrats, I mean, you hear them on all kinds of things. I mean, Cree Summer, for example, has done lots of stuff, as has E.G. Daily. I mean, she appeared in some Disney stuff later on. But I think our basis for recognizing those voices comes from the Nicktoons in the first place. If you ask me to name voices from other Nicktoons, I probably couldn't tell you, but Rugrats pretty much is there, isn't it? Like, it's so ingrained.
Probably because they were some of the like first ones. Also, I think maybe slightly edging them out or being up there is Patty Mayonnaise. That's such a signature voice, and when you hear her anywhere else, you know that is Patty Mayonnaise.
That is very true. Yeah, but how was that? It was sort of, hey, Doug, or something, wasn't it? It was very distinctive.
When she popped up as an actual actress on Orange is the New Black, that is like what everyone talked about. That was like a 20-something at the time. They're like, that's Patty Mayonnaise! So Nickelodeon also debuted Your Childhood Crush. Clarissa explains it all that year, and there was some chitter chatter about a reboot in which she'd play the mom, but Melissa Joan Hart has since noted that that's sort of dead in the water. But since we've seen her play an aunt, a mom, a teen in the past decade or so, well, not a teen in the past decade, why do you think Nickelodeon didn't go forward with a Clarissa reboot, especially in a time where reboots are very poppin'?
Well, I think when you look at other things like Saved by the Bell, they managed to reinvent them when they brought them back. I think something like Clarissa, it would literally just be Clarissa, but without Clarissa being Clarissa. Like it's a bit of an odd one. I actually went back and watched that show for the first time. It's literally just come to our streaming service here in the UK. And to be honest, I found it difficult to sit through about an episode and a half. And that's probably because I don't have the nostalgia for it. And to me, Melissa Joan Hart will always be Sabrina, or Melissa from Melissa and Joey. So it's very difficult. And I think maybe that's where they found it. They're like, well, it was great at the time, but how do you reinvent this so that it's actually different and not just a copycat?
True. Very true. But I mean, we just wanted to see it. I think it is the nostalgia of seeing her step back into that set, even though it would look really weird in today's TV being updated and everything in HD. It would look wild. It would look like they were like busted. But so I do want to talk about another aspect of TV, which was really big here, and I wanted to know if it was as big over there, were like daytime talk shows, especially not like the more sentimental ones, but more like the Maury's, like Not the Father and the Jerry Springers with the wild fighting. Was that something you guys had?
Not particularly. Not that I remember. I remember Jerry Springer being sort of big at one point. I'm not quite sure if it landed the same time here as it did there. But no, as far as I remember, and from research, those types of things, TV in this country is slightly different. The way, I mean, in the middle of the afternoon during the 90s, you had children's programs. So, they had to be very careful what they scheduled around it. Usually it's an Australian soap at that time. Neighbours was very big around that moment in time.
Yeah, we had the soap operas too, but I think we just have so much channels that they were able to do daytime talk and the soap operas as well. Soap operas were huge in the 90s. I would get sucked in the during summer vacation, and then I would go to school for the year, and then next summer I could just catch up in the day. That's I think the beauty of a soap opera. You could jump in and out years later, and the same characters there. They never go.
That's how they're written, and yeah. I think American soap operas are slightly different to the British counterpart, because the funny thing is, American soap operas are daytime fare. Mm-hmm. British soap operas, they play in prime time. And these days, soap operas are pretty much all you're getting on TV between 7 and 9 p.m. on pretty much all of the main channels, which I know to an American audience that might seem a little bit crazy, but it's just something that they've built, because what happened was, our biggest soap here was Coronation Street for a long time, and then other shows kind of came along as the decades progressed, and they all ended up shifting to that nighttime slot. I mean, certainly to talk from a British perspective for the moment, in the early 90s, around 91, Emmerdale Farm, as was, which started in 1972 as this rural, sleepy daytime soap, tried to go prime time in the early 90s, and a couple of years later would stage a plane crash, which basically killed a lot of characters, and tried to reinvent it into a much more mainstream show. But in 1991, it's still a little bit sleepy. They were playing some episodes on TV recently, and when something is almost so mundane that you just can't help it. You're like, I'm now entangled in the lives of these country folk, and I love it. I can't stop myself.
It reminds me of when I would go to my mom's to visit, and she would be into, say, a CSI or so, a crime show, and that's not something I'd particularly watch on my own, but they just suck you in, and it's kind of the same thing every week, but you're just like, well, I guess I'll watch an 8th episode with you, Mom. So
those shows are the best at that. I mean, you think about things like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. You've seen those episodes dozens of times, but you can't help but see it again.
Mm-hmm. I think that's what makes a classic TV shows. If it can transcend time, I think that's why I Love Lucy is personally my favorite TV show ever, because it's just classic comedy that will just never not be funny. For me.
I agree. I definitely agree. There is a reason why it was run on TV here in the early 80s when a new channel launched, and it was a big hit.
Yeah.
In the early 80s. So,
But another thing about TV that I didn't realize, obviously, as a kid, is that a lot of our shows were just designed to sell us toys. And I mean, it's true. And 2 that came out in 1991, two shows. They were based on films from the 80s, and that's Beetlejuice and Ghostbusters. Do you remember having any favorite toys that were based on TV shows growing up?
Well, it's funny you should say Ghostbusters. I had some Ghostbusters toys growing up. I even had, was it the car? At one point where you push the button and the siren came on. I was very into Ghostbusters at one point. I also had some Star Wars toys as a kid as well, sort of movies, TV. I think a lot of kids did because they were familiar brands, weren't they? They were sort of designed there. I mean, there's an episode of The Simpsons from the mid-90s that kind of plays on that, where there's a cartoon that's literally just there to sell toys, and it's got like it's like an 8-word title, and it's just a bunch of brands. And that's kind of what it was like. I think it's maybe less so, although I think the emergence of Bluey and Peppa Pig, etc., in this country perhaps has risen the amount of branded toys that you can get.
Oh man, I don't have children, but even I know Bluey. Bluey is a phenomenon, and my nephew did like Peppa Pig back in the day. He's 10 now, so he's old. But Bluey's a big hit, and I heard it's actually pretty good for adults to watch too.
There's a lot of parents I know who will put their kids to bed and they'll just continue watching Bluey. But at the same time, a little bit like the Rugrats thing, there's a lot of stuff in there for parents, and in some ways, the way in which these shows deal with subjects, you kind of wish that we'd had something like that when we were growing up. Because these days, I was very much, it's not like it was in the old days. I grew up on Hanna-Barbera cartoons and things like that. But now when I see what they've got and what subjects they cover, you do think, if only we'd had something like that had that kind of representation or that kind of approach to a subject.
What's interesting is people our age are probably the ones making this, so they're probably yearning for that as a kid. So now the creators are, giving what we didn't have. So who knows what the next generation, like your kid, will, give to the world.
Possibly. I mean, at the moment, it's Wallace and Gromit is the thing that we're watching quite a lot, which were made with there were 3 sort of short Wallace and Gromit films made between 1987 and 1995, which are mainstays on TV here. But they start in the 90s rules.
Well, the 90s had a lot of greatness, but in 1990 there was a TV show called Beauty and the Beast, and it is a wild ride. It has Ron Perlman as the Beast. He's like living in the sewers of, I think, New York City. And I always think it's crazy that it became this Disney powerhouse animated movie just a year later. And this was obviously a top moment of what's dubbed the Disney Renaissance. But for you, why do you think Beauty and the Beast is one of Disney's best?
That is such a tough one, isn't it? In terms of that Renaissance period, it possibly is the best because certainly in terms of story, I think it's the best. Musically, perhaps not. The Lion King probably picks that up. In terms of emotion, I think Little Mermaid's possibly better in that. It's a weird one, isn't it? It all depends on your point of view. And for me, Disney animation was much better in the early days, say between sort of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Robin Hood, their real golden age.
Robin Hood's one of my favorite, but for Disney, I think Beauty and the Beast, it's the grandness of the animation. It's that ballroom scene where they do the signature song. It's just for animation, it's just one of the most beautiful, most iconic scenes in movies, like animated or not. I think to me, it's kind of like the end of Titanic, just like, when she like passes and goes through and she's seeing Jack in her dream or whatever in the afterlife. I think it's got that kind of regal feeling. And that's always the scene we see whenever they do clips. But
visually, it's amazing. Yeah.
I think only matched up to it for me is Hunchback of Notre Dame. So I love that movie. So
I've
good.
never seen it, unfortunately.
You've never seen it?
No, there are quite a few Disney animated movies I haven't seen yet. I've seen all the, all the classic ones, but the ones from the last sort of 25 years, not so much.
Beauty and the Beast, it was the first animated movie to be nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars, but unfortunately, it didn't win. It was shut out by Silence of the Lambs, but isn't it wild that it took another decade, took 10 years before the Academy gave animated movies its actual own category?
Really, it took that long? I think perhaps what happened there was the emergence of other major animated studios. I mean, animators like Don Bluth were pairing up with the big studios to make Disney type things. I mean, certainly in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, I'm thinking of films like All Dogs Go to Heaven.
Yeah.
They make these films that people now think are Disney. And it's so funny that a lot of Don Bluth's films are owned by Disney now, but they were 20th Century Fox, which is now part of Disney, and yet they were made at the time almost as like a two fingers up at Disney. So it's weird. There were a lot of things that really surprises me that it took that long for there to be an animated category. But then for a long time, how many times in your childhood did someone say, I've got a VHS of Dumbo or Bambi or something, just sit down and watch that and I'll see you in 10 minutes sort of thing, just children's fare.
Yeah, the animation I think still isn't taken as serious, but can you guess the first animated movie to win Best Animated Feature?
10 years after. Is it Shrek?
Yes, it is the classic, the icon that is Shrek. Yes, Lord.
I used to do a Shrek impression, but I'm not going to do it because we're talking about 1991. I'm not going to do a Beast impression because I can't remember how he talks, but there we are.
So while Beauty and the Beast didn't win, it helped give kids so much that year. We got a lot of movies that year for kids. We had the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle sequel, we had Problem Child 2, and My Girl, which Casey from An Evening at the Movies, if you're listening, My Girl is not a romantic comedy. He likes to say it is. It is not. It's a tragedy. Anyways, do you think that we're lacking legit kids movies like that?
I think so. I mean, Father of the Bride came out that year as well, didn't it? Which is sort of a family comedy type thing. Yeah, I think we are lacking that now. I think people think that the family movie is really kind of either cheesy or just like a children's animation, because Disney are still making films that are classed as family, but they're animated films, and so people think they're for children. It's a weird thing. I think as well that there aren't as many child stars as there once was. I mean, certainly in the early 90s, shortly after 1991, in the next sort of 2 or 3 years, Mara Wilson was like the next big child star after Macaulay Culkin, I would argue, because Culkin was in pretty much everything family orientated between sort of 1988 and 95.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. We did have like this up because the 80s definitely had their child stars. We've all seen their tragic stories like in documentaries, and then the 90s we got really, I mean, look, like you said, Culkin was a blockbuster hit. You put him in anything, it was going to make money. Mara Wilson, JTT, Devon Sawa, all these people, and I think we took this big break, and not until Disney came with like the Hannah Montana, Selena Gomez's did it uptick again. But they weren't making those like family comedies. They were just doing their Disney show type thing and selling a lot of merchandise. It wasn't like it was in the 90s.
No, I think there was a degree of innocence that perhaps was lost afterwards, but maybe that's a good thing. Who knows?
Another hit in 1991, not so much family friendly, but it was a hit nonetheless. It had an impact on the US and the UK. Like we mentioned, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and I thought we weren't going to have any kind of the same songs in common, the US and the UK, but this, God, such a hit. That dang song from Robin Hood.
Yeah, what is it about that? It's funny that there's a famous rock band here in the United Kingdom that I also do a podcast for, and they had a song out at that time which didn't do very well. And usually, if you're judging anything and you look at a chart, and if it's a song at the top of the charts that's been there for weeks and weeks, you just go, well, it's their fault. It doesn't matter about the rest of the top 40. It's Bryan Adams' fault.
And you had a song over in the UK that was in the top 10 that wasn't in the US one, and I'm really shocked by that, because this is like Marky Mark, one of the most signature songs for me for the 90s, and that's Right Said Fred's I'm Too Sexy. Do you remember how big that was back in the day?
That was a huge song, certainly. Are you saying that wasn't really a hit in the States?
I mean, it was a hit, but it didn't chart. Like, for me, that, like, it feels like an bop. It feels like a Spice Girls. It was just a moment in music. It was so dumb, but so good.
It was one of those things. Yeah, definitely. I mean, his delivery on that song and subsequent songs. I mean, they did a charity song in the mid-90s called Stick It Out, which is a sort of a British innuendo. But yeah, Right Said Fred were huge, and certainly in my childhood, their presence was still felt because we had the I can't remember what brand it was, but the I'm Too Juicy ads for like some kind of sweet. So I think for about 5 to 10 years, that song was kind of it was big business. Big business. It's why they re-released it a couple of times in remix form. And you can't, I love rewriting songs with silly lyrics, and certainly that's one of them that you can do it with. It's just fun, isn't it?
Did you see? And another song that did really well overseas, it's actually from a 1990 album, but Do the Bartman charted so well in the UK in 91. It was your number 5 song of the year. Were you a fan of that one?
Oh, I love Do the Bartman. That entire album, Simpson Sings the Blues, is a great album, and it really has no right to be. And I do wonder, because the funny thing is, right? The Simpsons was on Fox, which is like a terrestrial, you don't have to pay extra for it or anything like that, as far as I know. It's certainly one of the big channels over there in the States. At that point, The Simpsons was on satellite, so you had to pay for it, and we didn't get it on basically terrestrial television until 1996. So the fact that song got anywhere probably shows either a lot of people suddenly had satellite, or that song was enough of a draw. I mean, certainly having a name like Michael Jackson drawn to it may have helped its sales, and the fact that rap and associated things and that music video, which would have played out on Saturday mornings, all would have helped it to become a huge hit. But The Simpsons wasn't a big mainstream thing at that moment in time that obviously it is now.
Mm-hmm. Like, you didn't get it over there unless you had satellite until a handful of years later. And I know it didn't come out in 91, but you can't talk about the 90s without talking about The Simpsons. Especially, I think the 90s had the most memorable episodes. I know it's still going on. I haven't watched it in maybe over a decade, but do you have any favorite Simpsons episodes or characters that you really like?
Oh my goodness. I think the episode, I think it's from series 3, which is about 92, 93, and it's the one with Spinal Tap in it. It's called The Otto Show, and I think I always quote things from it all the time. Let's be honest, I quote Simpsons all the time, all of it, mostly 90s episodes, but The Otto Show from series 3 is just brilliant in my view. It's the one where Otto goes to stay with the Simpsons. And there's a lot of memorable quotes in there. My favorite one being, "This is not Happy Days and he is not the Fonz." And Otto comes out of nowhere going, "Hey, Mr. S," or whatever. It's like, this is wonderful. As for other episodes, I mean, there's too many to count, isn't there? Because they were on fire at that point. And I'm always amazed when I go back and rewatch those things. I've tried to watch the modern seasons, but it was never a kid's show, even though they showed it on Saturday mornings at one point. It wasn't really a family show, although they did used to put it on at like 6 o'clock in the evening just before the news or while the news was on or something, which I used to watch quite a lot. But these days it's gone very adult and it's trying to compete with Family Guy. And I think if I'm going to watch it with my children, I need to know it's going to be okay in terms of content. So I tend to go back to the older episodes, because the newer ones, I haven't got a clue what's going to happen. And you really wouldn't believe the amount of times you start watching it, and within 2 seconds, your parent radar suddenly goes, oh, no, can't do that. Homer just did that. Can't do that. No, and yet in the 90s, Maggie hitting Homer on the head with a mallet was considered family entertainment.
I think it's because for me, I did love like the TGIF shows, like the Full House and the Family Matters. But when Fox came, it had the families that really represented what my family was, which was like trashy and not perfect. So like The Simpsons and Married with Children were just like right up our alley, and Fox like definitely grabbed our attention. It was like our favorite channel. But yeah, like I could imagine watching it with your kids and thinking that's a little much. Especially the way Bart acts. Now, like when you're little, you're like, he is the coolest, and now you're like, I would ground that child.
Oh, I think he was a moment in time. Mm-hmm. And they kind of riff on it later when he starts dancing on the school bus and he's like, do the Bartman, and then Ralph just says, that is so 1991. They know that really Homer took over as the dominant character in that show, and yet Homer is the most unlikable character ever. At times he just doesn't care. He gives bad advice. He does bad things. He makes bad choices. And yet he is the reason why that show is a success. Sorry, everybody else in the show. But Dan Castellaneta it just kills it.
I was talking to my husband about this morning, actually. He was like, it's weird how big Bart was in the 90s and then how big Homer became. And I was like, well, there's a conspiracy theory that early on, the episode where Homer goes into a coma, all these fans theorize that Homer actually dies or is in a coma, and everything since that episode has been his like dreams or whatever. And that's why it's gotten crazier than before that episode. So I think that's a cool theory. I wonder how it would play out when the show does eventually end. I don't know if I'll see the end in my lifetime, because I just can't imagine it not being there, even though I'm not watching. But
it needs to end. It really does need to end. They need to just put it in reruns and not do anything else, because they're talking about a second movie, which I can understand why. Disney have just bought 20th Century Fox. They want some money out of it, and The Simpsons is a cash cow. That they want to exploit this brand, but it really does need to end, because the best episodes, sorry people, but we're in the first 10 seasons. They were just memorable, they were funny, and a lot of them were referring to things from like 10, 20 years before. It took me years to get the Egg Council joke that's in one of the thing. Like, they do something, you're like, I know that's supposed to be funny, but I'm not sure why, and yet you still laugh. And that was the magic of The Simpsons. It didn't matter if you knew what it was referencing, it was just funny. Whereas now it's so obvious, and it ties itself in, because it's like, well, instead of referencing something from 5 or 10 years ago because someone's going to point out how dated it is, we'll just reference something from 5 minutes ago rerun it in a year's time and wonder if it stands up to scrutiny, which 9 times out of 10, it doesn't.
Well, I haven't heard that second movie thing, but I hope not. I actually just watched the first movie last year, and I don't know why I just didn't get around to it when it came out, but I just watched it and I was like, this wasn't great. It was fine, but
possibly the last good thing that they did was that movie. There were funny moments in it. There's a lot of memorable scenes in it, I think is what I will say, and it's probably the last great thing that they did.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, a lot of the things that I remember came in that first decade. But before we wrap up, I want to do some popcorn questions. So I have 50 questions. You're just going to give me a number 1 through 50. We're going to do 5 of them, and they're all 90s based. So first number, 1 through 50.
29.
Oh, this is obvious. What would you have done if you were left home alone at Christmas?
Well, I mean, you use the phone for a start to call somebody.
Phone lines are down.
Oh dear. Well, I mean, you go to a neighbour, don't you? Or you do what a certain McAllister did, and you stage an intervention with some burglars. I think that's what you do, isn't it?
We always watch them every year. I think anybody who is around this age does. It's just a tradition. And every year I'm like, he would have died. This is insane. This movie is wild and his family is trash.
Well, the stupid thing is that they do those stunts in that movie, don't they? There's that moment where the bad guys fall backwards, and they say Home Alone style because they invented a lot of things. At Christmas, I slipped over on the ice late last year, and my wife basically went, "You went down Home Alone style."
Did you get to see that movie Violent Night that just came out?
No.
Okay, well, it's like if you took Die Hard and Home Alone and it had a baby and it was a little like the title says, very violent. And they have a whole Home Alone like spoof type section that worked really well. That was really cool to see.
Right. Yeah. I maybe need to check that out when the kids have gone to bed.
Yeah, definitely not a family friendly movie, but what's your next number?
5.
Ooh. Backstreet Boys or NSYNC?
Oh, I'm gonna have to say on this occasion, Backstreet Boys.
Good answer. The only right answer.
I nearly said NSYNC, to be honest, for one song.
What song?
Pop.
It's a good one. I mean, I can't deny they're not. I mean, I like them, but at the time when I was in the boy band war of '99, I could not admit that because I was enlisted for the other side. Next number?
49.
We get to play our favorite game here, Fuck, Marry, Kill, with some leading men of the 90s. That is Brad Pitt, George Clooney, and Johnny Depp.
Okay. So, let's see. So, I would say, can you remind me of the actors, please?
Brad Pitt, George Clooney, and Johnny Depp.
Well, sorry, Johnny, kill. Clooney, marry.
And you gotta fuck Brad Pitt, which I think that's probably what a lot of people would do today, because Brad Pitt still looks amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I need to watch Bullet Train just for him alone. I keep seeing it on Netflix. I'm gonna hit play one day.
I mean, to be fair, I think after his appearance in Thelma and Louise, I'm surprised that didn't kill his career.
I was definitely too young to watch, but I did watch that, and I remember that is a pivotal moment in my life, seeing him jump on that bed. All right, next number.
Okay, 39.
If there was a gang fight, who would come out on top? The crew from Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter?
Oh, I would say Mortal Kombat, because Street Fighter, there's too many button combinations. And if they haven't been doing their homework, then they're going to get beaten up badly.
And plus, the people of Mortal Kombat kind of have these crazy powers.
Yes, that does seem to be the case. It's funny how people went crazy about how how violent it was. And yet you look at it now and you're like, oh, his head came off. Okay.
It doesn't look wild at all with that old school graphics. And your last number.
Okay. I'm going to go for number 2.
Well, we just talked about it. Do you think Clarissa really explained it all?
Considering I've only seen 1 episode, I'm going to say yes.
She got all that in the pilot. And before we say our goodbyes and everything, if you were the age you are now in 1991, what do you think you would be doing with your life?
Well, I would probably be what my dad was doing in 1991, probably in his room somewhere, wherever he was living, making mixtapes. That's sort of the modern day equivalent to podcasting, I would say. Possibly checking out some of those movies at the cinema and buying some VHS with whatever money I happen to have, just in case there's something that doesn't exist today. Preparing for YouTube.
Very good, very good. And can you remind people where we can find you in 90s and Noughties online?
Okay, so 90s and Noughties UK is available on all your favorite podcast providers, so Spotify, iTunes. Go find it. There's interviews, reviews, conversation, 90s and Noughties based. Go check it out.
All right. Well, Jamie, thank you again for coming back and talking about everything 1991 with me. And everyone, you can find all of Jamie's information below. And until next time, as always, keep crushing it.